Die reën val neer op berge, die reën val op valleie. Die reën word strome, die reën word riviere, die reën word 'n see. Kom aan reën.
I would say that, people are trying very hard to put the past behind them, Yeah, to put the past behind them and forget it and try and get on with their normal lives again. Pick up the different pieces of their shattered lives and build. Sometimes I think of these things, and become very, very agitated, feel like exploding. So in a way, you do have a community, consisting of walking time bombs. People who could explode at any time, who've got these pent-up emotions inside that are dying to manifest themselves. So one hopes that, these things would gradually, get out of one's mind, I'm not so sure if I'm not deluding myself, by reasoning along those lines, but what else can one do?
Johannesburg 1994. Angela und ich sind zurückgekommen in das neue Südafrika, um uns an das Alte zu erinnern, an die Zeit der Apartheid. Und um ein Stück der Erfahrung der Menschen zu dokumentieren, die im Untergrund für dieses neue Südafrika gekämpft haben. Die bleierne Zeit der Repression, des erloschenen Widerstands in den 60er und beginnenden 70er Jahren, an die der südafrikanische Schriftsteller Jabule Debele zurückdenkt in einem Text, aufgeschrieben Anfang der 90er Jahre, nach seiner Rückkehr aus dem Exil. Eine meiner bleibenden Erinnerungen an das alte Südafrika ist die Erinnerung daran, was Entfernung und Zeit beim Reisen bedeuteten. Dass die Entfernung etwas war, das ertragen werden musste in der Angst, angehalten und befragt zu werden nach seiner Existenzberechtigung. Keine Reise wurde unternommen mit der Gewissheit, sein Ziel zu erreichen. Nichts existierte zwischen Anfang und Ende der Reise als die Erwartung von Unheil. Soweto 1976, die Revolte der schwarzen Jugend. Hector Peterson, das erste erschossene Kind. Es ist eine Zeit der Opfer. Die Begräbnisse hören nicht mehr auf. Das war die Zeit, als ich zum ersten Mal nach Südafrika kam, mit dem journalistischen Auftrag, die so lange verstummten Stimmen des Widerstands zu sammeln. Die Zeit, als ich wie betäubt durch das von den Unruhen gezeichnete Soweto ging und zu verstehen versuchte, was ich da sah. Für Angela, die gebürtige Südafrikanerin, war es anders. Sie gehörte dazu, es war ihr Land. Und sie war seit langem Verbindungsglied zwischen südafrikanischer Opposition und der Solidaritätsszene in Deutschland. Als die Polizei am 16. Juni auf die friedlich demonstrierenden Schulkinder zielt und nach den ersten 3 Tagen des Aufstands Hunderte tot auf den Straßen Sowetos liegen, ist das der Wendepunkt.
It's not an easy thing to leave your country, to leave your friends, family, and venture into the unknown.
I just wanted to go, get my training, and come back afterwards.
It became clear to me that the only language they understood was the language of force.
The time has come to face these people.
Tausende junge Leute verlassen heimlich das Land. Alle sind von dem gleichen Gedanken beherrscht.
We shall return, definitely. We shall return.
Sie kommen zurück, ein paar Jahre später bei Nacht und Nebel, überqueren die Grenze illegal, ausgerüstet mit Guerillatraining, mit falschem Namen und falschem Pass, einer neuen Identität, einer neuen Lebensgeschichte, eingehüllt in ein Netz von Legends, wie es in der Codesprache des Untergrunds heißt. Legenden zur Tarnung, hinter denen sie selbst als Person verschwinden. Kevin Koboschane. Es ist auch seine Geschichte, um die es geht. Er ist gerade 16, noch ein Schuljunge, als er sich aufmacht und den Grenzzaun übersteigt Richtung Swasiland. Gut 25 Jahre ist das jetzt her.
It is only now that I realize what a normal life would have been for me at that time. I never had that. And I think I wouldn't be bitter. But if given a choice, I think I would have loved to have gone through that.
Jenny Kagel. Wir erzählen auch ihre Geschichte. Als Kevin sich auf den Weg zur Grenze nach Swasiland macht, sitzt sie als Studentin der Wirtschaftswissenschaften in den Hörsälen der Universität von Durban. Als Biko stirbt und ihre Kommilitonen Demonstrationen organisieren, ist sie mitten in der Vorbereitung für ihr Examen, das sie glänzend besteht. Wie Kevin verweigert sie sich den demonstrativen Gesten und bleibt studentischen Protestaktionen fern.
I think I felt as a white I had no place in South Africa when I was about 16, 17. And that the best thing to do is if you're a white and you couldn't challenge the system, it was to leave.
Sie ist 24 Jahre, hat eine Europareise hinter sich und arbeitet an Südafrikas führender Wirtschaftszeitung, als ich ihr 1978 begegne und fast auf der Stelle Freundschaft schließe mit ihr. 3 Jahre später begleitet sie ihren Mann Howard Barrell, der Korrespondent in Simbabwe wird, nach Harare. Ein paar Briefe von ihr, ein paar Ansichtskarten, der Tonfall darin immer ein wenig verhalten, als sei sie enttäuscht von Harare. Dann kommt sie überraschend wieder zurück. Sie geht ihrer Arbeit als Journalistin in Johannesburg nach wie eh und je. Sie ist unverändert, ich merke nichts. Wir machen Interviews, hören die Tonbänder ab, sitzen im Garten und hören Musik, alles wie vorher. Aber nichts ist wie vorher. Was ich nicht weiß, Jenny arbeitet im Auftrag des ANC im Untergrund. Ihr normal scheinendes Leben ist nur die Tarnung für ihr Geheimnis.
In the early hours of the morning, sometimes 6 in the morning, I would pack my lunch. I'd be about 10 years old, pack my breakfast, take my bag and my swimming costume, and then walk through the bush. Well, and I have memories of that being very silent, very quiet, at times a mist hanging over the trees. There were these huge gum trees with all bush around them, and I'd walk through that to the swimming pool. So in a sense, that was a loneliness, but it was one that I wanted to live with. And in a sense, the underground memories connect with that. I obviously lived an elite upbringing. My father was the general manager of the village we lived in, later a director of a major corporation. So from that perspective, we lived a very elite lifestyle. I think everything was generally available. Large house, very many servants working on the property, a clear divide between who the servants were and who we were, from the point of view that all servants would be black and we would be white. So one was very aware of those differences. There were hostel dwellers living right in the village, and we had access into those hostels as children, so we were running in and out. I always remember just a distance. They would look at us, they would watch us. We went onto their territory. Of course, they could never come anywhere near our territory. Their conditions were appalling. They were given sacks in which to cut the cane. I challenged my father once on why the cane cutters were given sacks. And he never answered that question. I was very young. I was probably about 8 or 9. I remember all the time as a child that I would look at someone who was black and let's say someone was being abusive to them, or they needed money and looked really unhappy and sorrowful. I could never cope with that. I always just felt dreadful when I saw that. Always wanted to go in and try and do something to make that right. And I often felt that that was a big motivator for me getting involved in the ANC.
I don't think I ever was interested in white people. They were very distant from me. There was no way or an excuse where I could get closer to them or to know them better. And besides, I think, to me, it was a no-go area. On my day-to-day type of life, they never existed. I spent most of the time in the township, where there were no white people. See, my mother left me to get married when I was still very, very young. So I was left in the care of my grandparents.
Es gibt nur wenige Fotos, die diese Kindheit dokumentieren. Ein Foto an der Wand vom fernen Vater, der ist als Musiker nach Amerika gegangen, da war Kevin 3. Als seine Mutter wieder heiratet, wird die sehr geliebte Großmutter zum Zentrum seiner Kindheit.
That was a very homely type of a situation, where you had brothers, where you had sisters, where you had uncles. There was always something happening in that house. There would be singing, the chatting, rating of old stories. You'd be listening. So I would have been the blue-eyed boy of the family at that particular moment. I went to school, I passed very well. I did my work at home, I never got into any problems, etc. So basically I was a very good boy.
Seine große Leidenschaft damals, das Lesen. Nachts kauert er sich ans Fenster, um Licht zu erhaschen vom Schein der Straßenlaterne, weil Kerzen zu teuer sind für das nächtliche Lesen.
I didn't have any form of political interest. My grandmother never used to, or any other person within the house, they never used to discuss politics or anything politically related. There are a number of things that are thrown at you that make you aware of the situation. Not in a very conscious way. I mean, the most basic one would be that a white man is superior. None of the people that I knew within the family or outside had a white friend. Now, in that house at home where I grew up, there was no bathroom. I'd never seen a bath ever in my life. But where my aunt used to work, they had bath shower area where I would fill a whole bathtub and jump in there and spend as much time as I wanted. But you do it as you're stealing something. And you learn to keep to your place.
I think one of the overriding feelings that I had when I was in the 70s and 80s was a complete alienation from your white community, that you just didn't agree with them. I had left school and then I'd worked and then I'd gone overseas, lived in London and lived in Amsterdam and then came back to study. I'd come back thinking, I must engage in anti-apartheid activity. If I'm going to live in South Africa, then I can't just not do something. But I couldn't identify with the student activists. So much of it was sort of platform politics. So I only, in fact, got politically involved once I started journalism. And then I felt happy with that engagement. It was through my professionalism as a journalist that I felt that I could do something. I could write about issues. I could expose them. It wasn't somehow marching in the streets and shouting the odds just didn't seem, for me, the right thing to do.
Your white activists were youngsters at university.
Joe Toloe, Journalist, damals Kollege von Jenny an der Sunday Post.
They would indulge in liberal politics. And then immediately they left university, they would go back to inherit their father's businesses, etc., and become part of the system, essentially. So I was always suspicious of them.
You know, I felt a lot more at home when I worked at Sunday Post, which was virtually all black journalists. And there was more of an identity, basically, on a viewpoint on the society.
I remember one incident where we were actually arrested at Jenny's house. That was funny. We went for a Christmas party at her house while we were on strike. Her neighbors were unhappy with so many blacks going into that house, and they phoned the police. And the police came and they took everybody to Newlands police station.
But again, both went off to different places. When I went home, I went in one direction. When they went home, they went in the opposite direction. 60 Becker Street. That was a little bit like a little enclave that was separate from your normal white society.
Becker Street was this little oasis of joy and fun.
Howard Barrell, Journalist, damals verheiratet mit Jenny.
In a very vulnerable place. It's where I met my first wife. I fell in love.
That was, in a sense, our sanctuary, away from the sort of horrendous side of apartheid. It felt like it.
And I always felt that it was like a magic garden, and these kind of military bulldozers were going to come in at some point. Well, they never did, but it was a place under threat. It was almost like a place of childhood under threat.
I was working for Drum magazine when we got this phone call saying that children are being shot in Soweto. I remember dropping the phone and walking away to go and cry, essentially. And I didn't understand how humans could do this to other human beings.
There was some kind of a shift towards horrible aggression on our part. There was complete faith that we had the power to change the system there. I would think that there was a serious change in my attitude towards white because I discovered for the first time that they could die. I discovered for the first time that they are not that superior. I discovered for the first time that we do have something in us that could make them run. And that's when you saw the expression in the African people throwing off a fist in the air, which is a much more emotional demonstration of the strength in you. And you also feel that I am human at last.
For me, if I think back to the 1970s, particularly after 1976 uprising, the feeling is one of fear. I think I was, like many people, kind of desperately seized with how do we move forward? I mean, how do we make things change? People were getting arrested, people were getting detained.
Every time there are footsteps in the yard at night, I suspect it's the police coming. 1977, they again came to collect me. They took me to Alexander Street police station. Now, it's a police station in a very isolated part of Pietermaritzburg. So you can scream your head off, nobody will hear you.
It was 7:45.
Sam Poloto, Gewerkschaftsführer, mit Jenny in einer Untergrundeinheit.
I went into the torture chamber at Compol on Monday, 7:45, and I went out there on Thursday at I think it was 5:15. Just count the hours. No sleep, no rest. All the time standing or blindfolded. All these days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, until in the afternoon.
They cover you with a blanket, and then they would use electrodes on your back here. And then you would scream and scream and scream because of the electric shocks at the back of your neck here. And then after a while, they would remove the blanket and say, why are you screaming? What is there? There's nothing here. Just seeing ghosts, that's all. Did the ghosts come visiting you under the blanket? And then after a while, they would do exactly the same thing again.
You know, after going through such a very cruel, action, it come to our mind that, it was better if you were dead than alive, I'm not speaking about maybe going to jail, no. You feel yourself not as a human being.
You talk to one person today and the next day you hear that that person is dead.
What does one do in this situation? You just feel this inadequacy. You feel sick with this feeling of inadequacy. So my journalism did expose me to developments which made me feel that I just had to become part of this thing. And the big problem was, what could I do which would be most effective?
I didn't go on with a normal life because a normal life wouldn't have been possible. I think to a lot of people, there was almost a revolutionary transformation in each one of them. You began to be much more critical, much more focused because I wanted to do something. And the most common thing to do at that time was to leave the country. We gathered at the house at about 6 early evening. And then we sat there, waited for transport. We were very quiet. I mean, if you know that you're going to be leaving at 9 and you're leaving forever, something must happen in you. The rule was that you don't tell anybody, don't tell your family when you're leaving. They don't see you leaving, etc. Then I had to agonize with this thing the whole day. And I broke the first rule. On the first day, I went to tell my grandmother. I just told her that, Ma, I'm leaving. And I was crying at that time. I was crying, real, that I am leaving. And what she does, she gives me 20 cents for my journey. She didn't have money, and all she had on her was the 20 cents piece, and she gave me that. Then I went back to the bedroom, took the bag, and I kissed her and I left. Then there was a driving through the night. The 12 of us in that car. There was no food, there was nothing. We didn't stop at any point. We didn't know the crossing point. We didn't know who was going to receive us. Nothing.
Johannesburg 1978. Meine Zeit mit Jenny und Howard in 60 Baker Street. Ich erinnere mich nicht, dass wir je die Frage direkter Beteiligung am Widerstandskampf besprochen hätten. Merkwürdig, dass es mir damals nicht in den Sinn kam, die beiden könnten spielen mit dem Gedanken an den Schritt in den Untergrund. Sie waren doch mit nichts anderem beschäftigt als mit der Frage, was kann man tun?
We see around us a political system which is legislatively brutal to a group of people purely on the basis of the color of their skin. And we as whites are the beneficiaries of this in some material senses. And there's a tremendous feeling of guilt.
I can't engage like that. I can't engage because I'm feeling guilty. Someone's making me feel guilty and I must go out and get arrested. If I'm going to engage, it's from a basis of serious objection on moral grounds, not on grounds of guilt.
Howard hatte den Militärdienst verweigert, als einer der ersten Weißen aus politischen, nicht aus religiösen Gründen. Und die Folgen für ihn waren traumatisch. Das konnte ich spüren.
These people had hurt me very badly, and I could see them hurting other people very badly, and I hated them for it, and I wanted to get rid of them.
So Howard went to see Hani, came back from Lesotho. Hani had asked whether we would get involved in propaganda and other underground activity on behalf of the ANC. And Howard didn't want to do it unless I was involved. So he said, would I do it? So I said, how many years in prison did the last person get for doing this kind of activity? And I think it was about 10 years in prison. So I said, I thought that was a lot of time in prison for an organisation I knew absolutely nothing about. So we said no. That was the first contact with the ANC. It was initially a no, that he would not work for them.
Zwischen Jenny und mir fiel damals kein einziges Wort über den ANC. Die überall herrschende Angst steckte an. Erst in einem Brief aus Simbabwe, sie war 1981 mit Howard nach Harare gezogen, erwähnte sie mir gegenüber zum ersten Mal einen Kontakt zum ANC.
Did it feel scary? I'm trying to remember. I don't think particularly. It felt like you needed to be careful. But I wasn't really doing anything but meeting. And I think it felt exciting more than scary, because this was like going for the forbidden fruit. And it's like, so it's got that appeal to it. I mean, people like Thabo Mbeki were absolutely enthralled by him. He was so impressive and so easy to get on with.
I knew that I was being drawn inexorably in that direction, that was where I was going to go.
The next hurdle was mustering up the courage to go and say, I want to join. Because it's very hidden. You meet odd people and then you would think, what am I supposed to do in order to join this organisation? Because it's got a lot of mystery around it. And how do you fit with that? How do you enter that, the channels into it?
I think part of my fear probably was, would I be well enough prepared in my mind for the step that I knew I was going to take?
It just felt that this had to be done. This was the right thing to do.
We arrived at about 6. That was at night. The tents all over. The dim lights in the tents, the lanterns. So you immediately knew that you've arrived where you've been going. There are a lot of things to learn at such places, lots. And the biggest one of them all is self-discipline.
From being a very angry man.
Sichlem Bongwa, Kommandant in der Untergrundarmee MK.
Only interested in taking up the gun and shooting. Probably without that broader understanding which I gained from the ANC, I could have merely picked up the AK, come inside the country and shoot whoever.
So you learn to get to grips with yourself and control your emotions, react much faster to situations, and also begin again to appreciate the next person next to you. After my first course, we were sent to Kashito and open up a new camp there. We had to build a camp from scratch. I didn't have a single skill except manpower. So I was never featured in any specialized area. I would be those that would cut, chop, carry the mules. I was very strong and I was very happy to carry.
Mandela is our
very, very beautiful course. That's where I met with the Russian instructors. The course was conducted by Russian instructors. To ANC, they were very dear. To MK, even much more dearer, because that's where we got most of our specialized courses from. Very little or nothing ever came from the Western countries, almost nothing. So meeting the Red Devils was like meeting the White Angels for us.
It's a funny thing when you enter something like that, how you abdicate a lot of your own decisions and you hand them over to someone else. It's a very strange process that takes place at that point, because you're very nervous. You don't know what the ANC is fully. I now knew about it theoretically, knew some of the people, but had no clue how it operated. No clue how they decided whether someone did something or not, and where they might think your value was. And would find it quite difficult when people in the ANC would say, "What do you want done?" That was the one question I found incredibly difficult. What do you think you can do? Because I always thought that they would know what needed to be done. I discovered later, of course, often people didn't know what needed to be done, and that's why you ended up getting this question all the time.
My experience of the ANC, and I think this is a very common experience, is that we used to spend at least 80% of our energy trying to overcome frustrations and difficulties in the ANC in order to spend 20% of our energy fighting the enemy. That's the ratio.
It was extraordinary how little support or input or conveyance of knowledge or training was then given. In fact, basically nothing. I ended up defining exactly what I thought needed to be done because we were getting no input at all from the ANC side.
Keinerlei Ausbildung, kein bestimmter Auftrag vom ANC. Sogar die Entscheidung zur Rückkehr nach Johannesburg, um dort Informationen zu sammeln für den ANC, war Jennys eigener Entschluss. Und auch ihre Coverstory erfindet sie selbst.
Endless discussions. Everything revolved around legends. What legend did you have? Why was I leaving him behind? Why was I coming back to South Africa? And I think that's when we made one of our first real mistakes, was we used our marriage or as a legend, our relationship.
Our cover story was that we'd had a terrible row.
We would talk through it, just incessantly, every little detail, because you want to get through that border. That was an extraordinary experience because you're going for the first time as a different person. I left as an ordinary South African. Now I'm going in fully illegal. You're going in to conduct a legal activity. So that you just feel different. You cross that border like you're another person.
From any country that bordered with South Africa into South Africa, crossing is not an easy matter. And usually, as you cross along the borders, tension comes, no matter who you are. If it didn't come, we are not real.
Jacob Zuma, damals Chef des Nachrichtendienstes, Vorgesetzter von Jenny und Kevin im Untergrund.
So you did feel that the situation is tense. And how do you deal with it?
You're talking of a group of human beings here that are being sent on what could be a one-way type of a trip. And all of them are thinking of that. All of them know the reality that I might come back and I might not come back. For the first time when I experienced all those funny nightmares, when you dream or you're trying to cross the border and all of your shirt gets caught in the barbed wire and you can't release yourself and you can see these people getting closer and closer and your comrades are getting further and further. Those type of things. But the most unfortunate part, we never had a situation that allowed for people to begin to talk about how they feel. Somehow everybody avoided that subject. And I think people were pressurized by the fact that I've decided to join the army. I can't afford to say I am scared.
Mai 1984. Kevins Weg zum ersten Mal wieder zurück ins Land. als Kommandant einer Einheit, verantwortlich für den Nachrichtendienst des ENC im Untergrund in Natal. Er hat in den 7 Jahren seiner Abwesenheit gelernt, wie man mit Waffen umgeht und Sprengstoff benutzt, wie man nachrichtendienstliche Informationen sammelt, Widerstand organisiert und die politischen Ziele des ENC vermittelt. Was aber bei der Ausbildung der Kader zu kurz gekommen war, wie man Tag für Tag im Untergrund überlebt, im Feindgebiet, mit wenig Geld und oft ohne logistische Hilfsmittel.
You look at the type of training, you look at the type of preparation that person received just before he went into the country, and you feel that this was murder.
Was Kevin erwartet? 27.000 Soldaten an den Grenzen Südafrikas und bei Straßensperren im Einsatz, stationiert gegen eindringende ENC-Kader, also gegen Menschen wie ihn. Und auch die Townships sind vom Militär besetzt. Es herrscht kriegsähnlicher Zustand.
I walked to the station, and most unfortunately, I went to a ticket office, and there was a white man there selling. Ordered a ticket to Durban in English, and this fellow responded in Afrikaans, and I just couldn't make out what he was saying. And he was not in a very, very friendly way. In fact, the very opposite. And I just couldn't understand what exactly I'd done wrong. And as I was moving away from the window, I then realized that on top there it was written whites only. And I actually nearly kicked myself for being so stupid. I then went to a much more African type of a window that would say, here you can buy your ticket, and I got the ticket. But really, I was not expecting that early. And it was like a shocking welcome back home, that things are like this here, and this is how you have to act. And even on getting onto the train, you have to check the whites only, the water. I think it was a very good welcome for me. But again, a funny feeling in me. It's a feeling where anything could happen, and we are sort of ready for it. You could get there, you could not get there, but you're quite clear and your mind is made up.
Bahnhof Pietermaritzburg. Eine fremde Stadt, in der Kevin ankommt, in der er niemanden kennt. Übernächtigt, erregt, ganz und gar abhängig von dem Kontaktmann, der ihn abholen soll, von dem er nicht weiß, wer er ist. Abhängig davon, dass das Treffen mit diesem Kontaktmann auf die Minute nach Plan abläuft. Aber es läuft nicht nach Plan ab. Die Albträume seiner letzten Nächte drohen wahr zu werden.
The agreement was that when I jump out of the train, he would be there waiting for me. And unfortunately, that didn't happen.
So when he came, he sat there, and he sat and sat and sat.
Svelim Kiese, Arzt, arbeitete zusammen mit Kevin im Untergrund.
1 hour went past, 2 hours went past, 3 hours went past, and there was no me.
One strong principle of underground work is that when you've gone to a meeting, the maximum time you spend waiting is 10 minutes. If the person doesn't turn up within 10 minutes, you have to move.
So he looked around and said to himself, look, I'm in trouble. I'm now going to be caught. 3 hours I'm sitting here. I don't know what mobilization is going on. This fellow is not here. I must move.
Where would I have gone to if I decided to move? I had no choice but to wait.
So he hasn't got a choice but to sit.
I think it was one of my longest of waits ever in life.
When I come into the place,
I immediately recognized him as a person to be picking me up.
I looked around and I looked at eyes which are interested in me.
But my reaction was like, take your time.
And then I see there's some young fellow sitting there with a smallish face and very dark, and so, but he's wearing a jacket, black one. Oh, he wasn't supposed to wear it, so I went past.
I allowed him to walk down the platform, and I stood up so that when he comes back, we then can have an encounter.
So was he relieved, the fellow?
Endlich können die beiden den Bahnhof verlassen. Nichts geschieht. Sie werden nicht verhaftet. Alles scheint normal. Es scheint, als sei die Panik, die Kevin in diesen Stunden des Wartens überfiel, vollkommen grundlos gewesen. Aber war sie grundlos? Was erwartete ihn?
We had already calculated, particularly around 1985, that the lifespan of a guerrilla here was 6 months. That if you get in a machinery, it gets blasted within 4 to 6 months. And it was a matter of when it's going to happen.
Operating inside was extremely stressful. And watching every move. And you're on enemy territory, so to speak. It's not that you're removed from it. You're operating right where they're everywhere. And so that seemed to be more need to be really so vigilant. It's always a problem of going to see somebody and that I bring danger to them. I think like for the first time I went back to see Bayers. He was one I thought should know, and then he could make up his mind whether he wanted to associate. He was the one person I told. You do need some sense of support from somebody so that you're not entirely alone. And I think that's important. There's somebody there that you absolutely trust.
That was the time.
Beyers Nodé, südafrikanischer Kirchenführer im Widerstand.
When I deliberately set aside also time to listen, especially to young blacks, of what was happening, of them telling me also of what they went through. And that was, to me, it was an absolute eye-opener.
So Bayers had such a wide network of people that I could say to him, what do you think of so-and-so? How do you feel about them? And he would know, he knew everybody.
You know, they came and shared with me part of their problems, their difficulties, the question, for instance, especially of young people leaving the country, needing money to leave the country.
Remember, he was banned. So you were always guaranteed that you would be seen going to Bayers' house.
I said to her, Jenny, you know, the easiest thing to do is if you could come to Emerensha Dam and then we just walk. Because then we can see if anybody else is following us. And in any case, it's not possible for people to overhear then.
And we never made it a regular time or a regular day of the week or anything. One thing important in underground is make nothing regular. Everything, you're constantly making sure that there's no pattern to your life. And the only pattern to your life is the one that you might want them to monitor. For the rest, you cut out any pattern. We collected on military personnel, different people. The military camp up the road from here on Eastgate. We would park on one side of the base, walk all the way to Eastgate, that was a couple of kilometres away, and come back the other way around and come to the car. But I mean, it definitely looked suspicious if anybody was following. So that's when it was very important to do the check routes and make sure we were not followed. There was a whole layout you wanted to get to know. You could only do it by walking around very slowly and very often, over months, till I knew its scale, its size, its movements, its personnel numbers, all sorts of things, just from observation. It carried a heavy responsibility. If you monitor people's movements, you've got them down to the last, how they move, come and go, so that they are very vulnerable. If MK had been more efficient, I mean, there would have probably been much more direct consequences to what we had provided them on information in terms of deaths. Where it got much closer was in the 90s, and then there was a choice. Is this person killed or not?
Das von Jenny observierte Militärgelände Eastgate wird nicht zum Angriffsziel der Untergrundarmee. Aber die Überfälle auf Polizeistationen, Elektrizitätswerke und Überlandleitungen häufen sich. Terrorakte, verübt von Terroristen, wie die offiziellen Meldungen lauten. Mir fällt auf, wie suggestiv diese Sprache ist. Terror. Auch in meinem Bewusstsein bleibt etwas hängen von der Botschaft dieses Worts. Mehr als 100 Terroristen bei 42 Terrorakten verhaftet oder eliminiert. Das ist die Bilanz am Ende des Jahres in den Worten der Sicherheitspolizei.
Once I'd been in for 6 months or so, the ANC then outside said, we would like you to send out young people for training. And that's when I nearly had heart failure. I said, you want me to go and meet a whole lot of young people and send them out to you, and then they come back inside the country again and organise all of that. And I said, it's very, very risky.
Everybody was afraid of that, that if I take this particular person into confidence, I might, sacrifice my life.
Jenny came to our offices, to the office of the union, and then asked for me.
Rita Nzanga, Gewerkschaftsführerin, mit Jenny in einer Untergrundeinheit.
Then she came to me and spoke to me and said she's been sent by the movement to come to me.
I approached Rita on the advice of Bayers.
A white girl, and such a beautiful girl. I can see that she had all, oh, now there's a sound of, she had all, her future in front of her, and I could see she was brilliant, and you could see that she was from a well-to-do family, and I became a bit suspicious of her.
Someone would come with such story, and yet he's an informer in order to come and trap you.
So I went to meet Bayers Nodie, and I asked him, Bayers said, work with her, support her, do everything with her, she's okay. She's been sent to come and help you.
No, this is a very dangerous game. It's very dangerous, no doubt about it. How can she, if she is picked, I even pictured her. If she can be picked, the security will mess her up. 1, 2, 3 days, she'll be a mess.
But at the end of the day, we ran some very efficient and excellent units. I mean, Peter, we set up a cross-border line so we could move people illegally across the borders. He would pick up the people. He would then have a legend all the way through the journey. It would change. And he would give them soccer shirts or different sports things and that sort of stuff. He never spoke to them. All he would say to them is, we're going to head for this town. If we stopped at a roadblock, we're part of a soccer team and we're going to play soccer in this town. Once they passed that town, he'd give them the next legend for the next town until they got to the border and the old man. And then they would have the contact.
If it backfires, it comes straight to your head. It knocks you off. And that is 20 years in Robben Island, that's for sure. If you can survive the torture. Sometimes, we made some arrangement, to meet. And you'll find that maybe I am late.
For him, it was not a crisis if you're half an hour late. For me, it was absolute crisis if you're sitting in a strange area and you're feeling fairly vulnerable to put up with that lateness. Everything should work much more to clockwork.
Her problem was that now she wants things to be chopped.
I found it very difficult. I think we came from very different generations. We had a very different concept of how you organize and manage something.
First of all, you've got to consider the village men at the border. You've got to consider the transport. Maybe our transport, breaks down, and the whole network, collapses. You are correct to say, she's from another background, and I, a man on the ground, I've got to consider all this. Because really our problem was the communication between the the external forces and the internal forces. We didn't have a good communication. And now Jeannie brought in something where you can write a letter with numbers, you know, and send it, you know. That was very good.
I also concealed in special cards these negatives. You'd split the cards and stick them down. I mean, I was an absolute past master. I would literally, I mean, the amount of hours I spent on this.
Very good. It was a fantastic, you know. That's why I said after she came in, you know, there was improvement in communication, in work.
Control was a big issue. That's what Underground was about. It was always trying to control one's environment, saying, I'm going to put myself into a risky position. Now I'm going to build up a whole series of controls to minimize that risk. And one of the most difficult things is you get worried that they bug your house. It's when they intrude on your personal life. So if you're having sex, every argument with your husband, every intimacy can be recorded. And that's the thing that is most bothersome. And there'd been quite a few indications of being watched at the time, and there were guys planted on corners and that sort of thing. And I remember just lying in bed and just crying and crying and crying, not wanting to go out. So it never, ever leaves you. This consciousness that you've been possibly watched. Every movement and action, I think, feels very self-conscious. It was always aware of who was around me. I was always looking at that. Who was close by? What did they look like? What were they doing? Always conscious of that. It gets less and less natural because you're living another life, and you've got to perform in a particular way.
Lying became second nature as a result of that. I mean, if ever I found myself telling the truth, I'd get a terrible fright and think, what have I given away?
You'd never share that agenda with anybody else. So there's this big secret that governs everything you do, the whole way you behave.
I remember really needing her for reasons I don't want to go into. But and she said I would have to leave.
No, we couldn't have her. We did all our underground work in the house. The photography was done. Everything was concealed and hidden in special places. And it was too tense. You know, we were a young married couple in a very, very difficult circumstances. I said to Howard, I can't have her. It's just impossible. We cannot exist like this.
In political process, particularly in the revolutionary process, clandestine process, all relationships, all people, all things are instrumentalized to the cause. And that is the big problem. It's the big dehumanizing, desensitizing problem.
The one issue that really struck me once was in the park in Yeovil. And we were sitting in the park, and it was still the days of the pass laws. So if you didn't have a pass on you, you'd get arrested. And a pass law van drove up into the park, and they started grabbing people and throwing them into the van, the police. And this one person was resisting with all their might. I've never, ever heard such screams and cries and despair in my life. And Howard and I both just sat there, and we said, you know, we can't go into that situation, and we just watched it. And I think that was the one time I resented the underground work, that I couldn't respond spontaneously to a very incredibly unjust system. And the doubt I have now, was it worth just sitting there? Because when I look back, I just wondered what I ever achieved in the ANC, and sometimes the human response can achieve more.
Natal 1984. Nach 7 Jahren Abwesenheit ist Kevin endlich zurück im Land und ist doch nicht zu Hause. Illegal mit falschem Namen und falschem Pass ist er offiziell nicht existent. Sehr allein, ohne Freunde, ohne Familie, immer auf der Hut. Kontakt hat er nur mit wenigen Kampfgefährten, die im Untergrund arbeiten wie er.
It's a feeling of extreme loneliness. Extreme loneliness in a big pot full of people.
Untergebracht von Sweli zunächst im Krankenhaus Edendale, wo Sweli ein Zimmer hat. Aber der arbeitet den Tag über als Arzt.
I didn't meet with anybody. They hardly ever saw me in the township or saw me at all. People had no clue in terms of who I was. They just took me as one of the activists.
Sich sein Leben im Untergrund vorzustellen, fällt schwer. Sein Bericht darüber ist spröde und wortkarg. Es ist, als könne er das Schweigen, das im Untergrund Überlebensstrategie war, auch heute nicht brechen.
It's during that time that, I got involved with Kevin.
Sifiso Kunene, Jugendlicher aus dem Township Chesterville.
I didn't know him as Kevin then. I knew him as Tiger. That's the name he was going under then.
He was one of the most wonderful operators underground.
Very secretive, you may even say a bit withdrawn.
I sent him into the country many times. He's one fellow I knew I sent him will come. And even when we suspected there was some danger in our structures, we were able to coordinate with him to avoid the danger.
Die Gefahr zu vermeiden war fast nicht möglich. Denn was Kevin niemandem erzählt hat, er ist überzeugt, dass der für die Untergrundoperation in Südafrika verantwortliche Kommandant des ANC in Swasiland ein Agent des Regimes ist. Und das heißt, Kevin steht zwischen 2 Fronten. Er muss sich schützen vor Entdeckung seiner Identität durch die Sicherheitspolizei und gleichzeitig vor Verrat im eigenen Lager. Und nicht einmal mit den eigenen Gefährten kann er seinen Verdacht teilen, um ihre Kampfmoral nicht aufs Spiel zu setzen. Über seine Arbeit spricht er nur in Andeutungen. Sie bleibt für uns schemenhaft. Er ist, wie uns scheint, der Mann ganz im Hintergrund, der plant, berät, koordiniert und organisiert. Nur selten berichtet er von konkreten Aktionen.
Propaganda work is very risky, very, very dangerous. I would consider it to be much more dangerous than picking up a gun and going to shoot a target, because it can always disappear. And a duplicating machine is very noisy. It goes kusho, 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 and you'd need to have a person there.
I had been given the task of recruiting, a person from each township now, to distribute those pamphlets, and I did. It was all over Durban, in a matter of 24 hours now. And those are things that must have astounded, the security police.
Did you also have a code name?
Why should I say that to you? Yes, I did.
But you wouldn't like to reveal that name?
No. In my mind, there are 2 compartments. One for things I can discuss with anybody. One for things I discuss only with a select few. My mind has been conditioned like that by my involvement in the struggle.
You tend to live dual lives, and you've got to make sure that the 2 don't mix.
A life of a normal person and the life of an undergrounder. Quite taxing, because it needed you to be so careful.
It creates a very, very big conflict in you, where you can see a person moving towards you, and you know that the person is moving towards a very, very big lie. No matter how much that person would try to probe you, you have this wall. You know that this person can penetrate to this level and nothing more. It gets to be very, very scary when people get to be very close to you. Where the fear begins to be, what if they discover who I really am?
It's not always easy, but you learn to live like that, because your survival depends on it. Your very life, depends on it.
Sifiso Konene, für uns in gewissem Sinn das alter Ego von Kevin. Etwa so alt wie Kevin war, als er das Land verließ. Von dem gleichen revolutionären Fieber beseelt, mit dem auch Kevin sich auf den Weg gemacht hatte in Exil und Untergrund. Ein Junge, aufgewachsen in der Post-Soweto-Zeit, der Zeit der besonders schlimmen Repression zu Beginn der 80er Jahre.
If you were a male, of about 14, 15, 16 years, upwards, you always ran the risk of being killed, of being stopped in the street. Like in 1985, when the security police came for me, took me to the Ridge Road police station, stripped me naked, and they tortured the hell out of me. But the final straw came after the murder of my brother. It's then that I moved irrevocably towards the ANC camp. It was in March 1986. They continued to send threats that tell that Sifiso that we would get him, and this time we're going to kill him. I was in the township, though not at home, one morning when my sister came to tell me, look, Polly is dead. He had been killed by members of the A-team who had attacked my home the night before. I went home. His body was still there, the corpse, lying just outside that small room where he used to sleep, with 4 bullets in the chest, and he was cold, and dead. Yeah, and that was it.
Do you know who really did it?
Yeah, I know.
They are still in the township?
Yeah, they are.
Can you a little bit describe the situation of the A-team at that time? Did they terrorize the whole of the community?
Yeah, they did. They did, and they had the support of the police, That is why they were a law unto themselves, just like the police now, who could kill people and get away with it. I was the only activist in the family, and my brother went. And his 2 children are alive and they're growing up. That sense of guilt was always there. But it's a price that had to be paid anyway. Somebody had to do what we did. And the underground is what gave respect to people who otherwise lived in a society where they were not accorded any respect. It was inevitable that we should have done something to defend ourselves. And the only people we could look up to support us in that, and with not only the know-how, but also the necessary equipment, were the ANC.
Their hopes were very high, and this was one step that was supposed to be taken logically, and they had to have the guns.
Because people were getting killed, right, left, and center. So at that time, we had made Road 16 the headquarters of the comrades in the township, and Road 16 shares a border with the cemetery. So we would go to the cemetery sometimes and sleep. We had the feeling that that place was, somewhat out of reach for the police and their friends, in the A-team. And also, we were at home there. Not because we had any penchant for graves and cemeteries, but the absurdity of the situation, that normal boys of school-going age, could be plotting things from the cemetery. It shows you just how crazy the whole place was. In the early hours of the morning, there was this staccato of machine gun fire. Then we had people screaming, shooting with rifles, and the people that were being attacked, shooting back with pistols and throwing petrol bombs, and it was happening, in the area, inside the cemetery. Those people, they never had respect for anybody. If God had come down to earth, surely they would have, asked him for a passbook in the street, Now, people who regarded blacks as subhumans never could have respected blacks when they were dead, or their place of final rest.
Angela stößt auf Briefe ihres Urgroßvaters, der im 19. Jahrhundert aus England nach Südafrika kam und der als einer der Gründungsväter von Durban dort heute noch im Museum für Heimatgeschichte präsent ist. Erschrecken und Beklemmung über den Text dieser Briefe und die Frage in unserem Kopf, ob nur die Geburt an anderem Ort zu anderer Zeit uns vor ähnlichem Denken bewahrt hat. Durban, 9. März 1867. Es ist wieder Krieg ausgebrochen zwischen den Siedlern und den Kaffern. Ich hoffe, wir werden nicht hineingezogen. Es hört sich hart an, aber es scheint so, dass nichts anderes übrig bleibt, als diese Wilden, wenn möglich, alle umzubringen und damit in Zukunft den Kriegen ein Ende zu bereiten. Wenn ich persönlich aufgerufen würde, teilzunehmen, würde ich versuchen, alles, was ich könnte, zu zerstören. Es ist schrecklich zu denken, so viele Seelen unvorbereitet in die Ewigkeit zu schicken, aber die Sicherheit der gesamten weißen Bevölkerung hängt davon ab, den Schwarzen eine Lektion zu erteilen. 120 Jahre später schreibt Cefiso in sein Tagebuch: Füge Phosphor hinzu und schließe den Deckel. Wähle den Ort der Detonation, entferne den Deckel, zünde die Lunte, entferne dich ganz ruhig und normal. Zum Zeitpunkt der Explosion wirst du heil und sicher sein. Und direkt daneben: An meine Liebste. Mögen deine Tage von Freude erfüllt sein. Möge dein Name nichts anderes bedeuten als Glück. Mögest du nie aufhören, mich treu zu lieben. Möge die Liebe, die ich dir gebe, dir genug sein, bis der Kelch deiner Sehnsucht überfließt in Erfüllung. Mein Liebstes, ich schließe diesen Umschlag mit Tränen der Einsamkeit und mit ewiger Liebe, bis wir uns wiedersehen. Ich liebe dich, Cefiso.
I was moving around all the time. Never had time to be with her and never had time to build a solid relationship with her. I only had time to build a solid relationship with the underground.
Für Kevin könnte es leichter sein und ist doch noch schwerer. Die Frau, die er liebt, die er heiratet, Cosi, ist eine Kampfgefährtin des Untergrunds wie er. Aber sie ist stationiert weit entfernt von ihm jenseits der Grenze. Es ist fast wie in den klassischen Liebesgeschichten, sie können zueinander nicht kommen. Und nicht einmal die Briefe, die er ihr Nacht für Nacht schreibt, kann er ihr schicken. Die Sicherheitsregeln verbieten das.
Really, they would have really been quite a wonderful couple, But this is life, so you take what you have. You don't start wishing for what you don't have.
The marriage in me meant a lot. It was a marriage that was part and parcel of me, my growing up, my work, my everything. It's like I'm looking at a flood, taking whatever that had made me, that is responsible for me, that is part and parcel of me completely, and hopelessly looking at it being washed away, and I felt very empty. the structure began to crumble.
We recognized that, there was serious trouble coming.
One of the key people in the structure died from a grenade blast.
Tula, dessen Tod zunächst rätselhaft war, ein enger Freund von Sifiso. Bei einem Angriff der Gruppe auf patrouillierende Panzerwagen wird er von der Granate zerrissen, die er selbst zündete. Und niemand wusste, was wirklich geschehen war.
There were still a lot of unanswered questions.
You sit there and analyze things and then say, no. There's something fishy here.
It's then that they decided to inspect the weapons and realized that the AK-47s had no striking pins. That was the time that we began to suspect that there was something terribly wrong with these weapons.
It took us a while, but part of the eye-opening came from Kevin to me.
The commander, one of the key commanders from outside, that was servicing the military structure was actually later proven to be an enemy agent.
Some of the commanders were working for the wrong side. And they were working for the wrong side completely. They were working with the Boers, with the South African regime as agents.
To talk with Tula's family. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to go to a mother and explain the circumstances under which, her son died.
We can never know the true extent of casualties that this struggle has produced. What we have not spoken about are those who have got psychological trauma out of the process. We have got those who have lost wives, who have lost husbands, those whose marriages broke up. We've got those who have gone on to suicide. We've got those, it's a whole range. And there's no way you can ever calculate that and know what it cost. I think many of us are to an extent, various grades of victims of the process that we have come from.
Because of the rapid development of the structure on the military side, something happened.
There was a terrible bomb blast that really had serious consequences. And therefore the police activity went and raided almost all the units which were in that area.
Which then collapsed the military structure altogether, which then had a direct effect on our structure.
That was December 16. Then we had a few days, literally, to survive. A lot of neighbors had woken up, the dogs screaming and so forth. There were about 30 cars, quite a number of car spares. I could identify 7 or 9 just around the house and so forth, which was a big fanfare.
Banging on the doors, the wall, and, with dogs barking and, torches all over the place. Then they said, open up.
In the first instance, I was escorted. Then all of a sudden, the guards next to me were moving out of me so that I walked there alone. Then I felt that, no, the aim is to shoot. I was just waiting for the sound. Then I was thrown into that car, then moved to CR Swart police station for interrogation.
I was put under Section 29. No lawyer, no reading material, no visits from your family, and solitary confinement. I used to play with the ants, that used to run through the cell. So they kept me company there. And, I had even given them names, Yes, I would build a circle, confine them, into this circle, build, a cycle using Vaseline. That's it. So they'll be confined there. We will play. I'll chase them around the cell. Those are the things that kept one sane-minded.
I looked at the newspaper. I got shocked. Yes.
They actually, in the front page article, indicated that they were looking for a professional man in Maritzburg, which meant Zweli.
And I knew for sure that means that's the end of the day.
He never said, look, I can't go, or it's difficult for me to go. He never said all that.
It doesn't really matter what I feel. The point is the process has to go on.
But you feel for a person.
Terrible. It was terrible. I knew I was going to exile and I would not come back. I'll never find this old lady back alive. But I can't tell her I'm going. And if I tell her, she's going to be devastated. Now, what do I say to her? How do you say bye-bye to somebody and you might never see her? So when I was out there, as I was taking the car, and the kids were excited and, screaming, hey, bye-bye. I then reached for my wallet, and there had lots of coins, you see. So I said to them, no, go and give it to the old lady and tell her this she would use for her offerings in the church. And then I drove off.
Wie ein verhängnisvolles Postskriptum zu dieser Flucht, die gelingen wird. 2 Tage später wird der Helfer, der die Flucht organisiert hat, verhaftet. Kevin, der sein unmittelbarer Kontaktmann ist, gerät zum ersten Mal selbst ins Visier der Polizei.
I could be picked up at any moment. They know who they're looking for, and they know me for a fact. They had never come this close to myself. But now, for the first time, you could be the link now to the rest of the structure, and that was very, very scary for me.
Pet's Kitchen, eine Herberge direkt neben dem Polizeirevier. Ein merkwürdiger Zufluchtsort, ein Waghalsiger für jemanden, der vor der Polizei flieht.
The basic reasoning here is that they wouldn't look for you at their doorstep. Rather, they'd go into the township to look for you. And I booked there for a week, and I stayed with Kose. In the evening, I would go into the bar and have a drink with the cops.
Seine Rechnung geht auf. Das Versteck in der Höhle des Löwen, die unmittelbare Nähe zu seinen Verfolgern, wird zum Schutzraum für seine Tarnung.
That's one of the loneliest of my periods, because Kose would leave in the morning for work and only come back at about 5. And then you've got all this tension that you could be discovered.
Wie auf Messers Schneide. Das war das Gefühl, erzählt er. Und dieses Gefühl begleitet ihn, bis er sein Versteck verlässt und sich auf den Weg macht nach Durban, um dort unterzutauchen.
It was looking messy. It was looking like we didn't have much time. And I was called out.
And I think we both began to feel that we were under surveillance.
Howard phoned in an absolute panic. He was being followed. His father had phoned him in crisis. His father said, he just phoned him and said, get her out. They're going to pick her up. Get her out fast. She's in serious danger. And sort it out. And he put the phone down.
Jenny quickly ducked underground, went underground, disappeared.
We didn't hear from her. For weeks on end, we did not hear from her. And there was no way that we could get in touch. We didn't know.
I never told them. I was involved in the ANC. They didn't know anything. They only found out most of it when I got back to the country.
She didn't tell us anything about her life. Yeah.
So I then met my unit people.
It was really the most difficult moment in my life, knowing very well that really I'm going to be picked, no doubt about it. And where does this lead whether it's jail or whether it's what, I don't know. But now, I think, if I still remember very, she said, how about, going outside the country? No, I dismissed that.
Why?
Yeah, I said no. You can't all go outside the country. There must be other comrades within the country who will now carry other part of the pillars of the struggle. I said no, I will remain up inside the country.
It must have been about 4 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning. The car broke down outside Pretoria. It was really weird. And I found myself in Marabastad, which is an old Pretoria township. In a sense, it's one of the last images of South Africa, which was having an image having entered a township. Stuck there, seeking help, getting help, and then leaving.
...1986 in Berlin. Ich hatte von Jenny seit einem Jahr keine Nachricht mehr. Ich konnte sie auch nicht erreichen, als ich im April 86 in Südafrika war. Keiner wusste etwas von ihr. Jenny blieb unauffindbar. Ich wusste nicht, dass sie zur gleichen Zeit in Berlin war, in meiner Stadt, nah und doch weit weg von mir, weil sie ein paar Kilometer weiter östlich jenseits der Mauer war. 6 Monate lang, zur Ausbildung im militärischen Nachrichtendienst durch Staatssicherheitsbeamte der DDR in Ost-Berlin. Fast 10 Jahre später, 1995, begleiten wir sie durch ein Berlin ohne Mauer. Zum ersten Mal fährt sie mit der S-Bahn von Ost nach West, vorbei an dem Reichstag, der von Christo verhüllt worden ist. Für uns wie ein Zeichen für den Raum des Erinnerns, des Nachdenkens über Geschichte, auch über die, die hinter ihr liegt.
There was ambivalence around the GDR and the sense one had of this society about the fact that people can't cross borders freely. But it was not my problem. It was not my concern at all. My concern was to learn to be better equipped to fight the South African regime.
It's very strange when you come back to where you trained and where your allies are and everything is just derelict. It's a bit frightening, it's a bit of a shock. Yeah. Because this is what represented our source of strength. What was seen to be the strength and power of East Germany, and it's completely gone. There's nothing, it's deserted. So it is a very strange feeling, because this almost says, well, how strong was that base we stepped from? What foundation did we really establish?
The fact that we chose a secret, hidden way to fight in order to achieve an open, free life has a contradiction. And that as an organization, the ANC now has to deal with that contradiction as well, because it built up a culture that was hidden, and it's got to start unraveling that culture and start coming out into the open, and it's done that. It's done that to some degree. And I think part of your question is also saying, I mean, were we right to go for an armed struggle? Were we right to go for an underground struggle to oppose the South African regime? We did. I'm not sure it was the only choice, because I think what we were taught was that there was no other choice.
It was a very constrained armed struggle. There's probably never been one conducted for so long in such a constrained manner.
Why did you have to learn to shoot?
Well, obviously, if you were going to be sent inside, and look at all the cartridges, the empty cartridges. Yeah. These are from AKs. So the shooting was helpful because we could get killed any time.
Did this military experience change you as a person?
I don't know. You might need to ask someone else. I think I don't know. Maybe one hardens a little bit. That it brings you closer to dealing much more directly with violence and death. The world was seen in such extreme forms. Everything was black or white. There were very few shades of grey. So the enemy's the enemy, and the good are the good. And that's it. What struck me so much coming out was that judgment and categorization of people is probably one of the least humanistic features one can find in life. And if you start accepting that life is full of ambiguity, then a struggle like this doesn't exist. So I'm left with a lot of doubts around a struggle of this kind.
Nach einem halben Jahr Training hatte Jenny Berlin wieder verlassen und ihr Weggehen blieb von mir so unbemerkt wie ihr Ankommen.
When I came back from Berlin, I was immediately brought onto the command structure of intelligence and security for Zimbabwe as a region, running the units we did have inside the country and how to find new units, how to recruit new people.
One thing that Jenny, because she ultimately became my handler, did very well was to instill confidence in the way that she interacted with me.
Bonani Mufamadi, Untergrundkader unter Führung von Jenny.
I was aware, for example, that communication between units inside the country and the ANC outside was one particular problem, very difficult. But that was never a problem with me and Jenny.
I would always try to ensure that if people were phoning through with messages, that I would always be there, absolutely on time, that I never let them down, that they never felt the communication lines were breaking because I was not delivering. So for me, that was very important to be completely rigorous.
And from there, I realized that she was a particularly good person with underground work, and that she paid attention to it, and more importantly, paid attention to the people she worked with inside the country.
I think some people were in the underground who should never have been. They should have been doing something else. They just didn't suit their personalities.
They're dealing with the whole spectrum of humanity there.
Phyllis Naidu, Rechtsanwältin und Führungsfigur des ANC im Exil.
It was very difficult. And then that humanity came from a criminalized country. I mean, where people who wanted a home had to beg, had to pay money on the quiet to get a home, you know? And if you didn't have a dom pass, if you couldn't get it, through the legal channels, you got it through the illegal channels. To get a job in the mines, you had to pay these fellas a whole lot of bribes before you can get it. I mean, this is ordinary living. And everybody was a criminal in that respect. And you take this now and make freedom fighters out of that. It's a very difficult struggle.
I think the problem was we were trying to almost make a mass-based underground. And that's very difficult.
So the ANC had a very difficult job to do in respect of its membership. And in fact, there are so many things we did wrong, but I think we have a very proud record of what we did do and do it right.
The concern in Harare was always individual assassination. Only the comrades on the command unit knew where I lived. And I didn't give my telephone numbers out to people. And when we stayed in houses or were with people, you always made sure you knew a window where you'd loosen the burglar bars, that if there was any attack, you always looked where the escape route was. So there was always that sense of where you were going to run like hell, basically, the minute there was an attack. you make sure you sleep in really good solid pajamas. Because if you run, you don't want to run in your knickers for some reason and go herring. But you'd think of those things. I mean, that's what I mean about that. Everything was self-conscious. It wasn't like you would strip and just go to sleep. It would be, God, I must always have pajamas and always be ready, and there was always a gun next to you, next to me, and that sort of stuff.
There's one situation, for instance, when I was in Swaziland, where they kidnapped one comrade, Mapumulo, next to the flat where I was in. It was the same block of flats.
Tsidi Mhlambo, mit Jenny zusammen im Untergrund in Zimbabwe.
Because I actually saw them taking him. He was bleeding, carrying him, forcing him to the back seat. I couldn't save him. I couldn't do anything. He died on the way. That's one memory I can never forget. Or sometimes I feel I can't even forgive myself for watching.
Look at all the people that died in front of us in Lesotho. I mean, that was the most traumatic thing for all of us.
If I had a gun, I would have shot those people. Because I knew I was a sniper too in my training. So I always had that in mind, that if I were to find myself in that kind of situation, I would be in a position to kill the enemy.
They had to be met at that level, in other words, armed struggle. One couldn't hope merely to cause political problems for them. One had to fight them militarily. And so that was my vision. I felt that I was ready to be trained militarily and go back there and deal with those security police. There were in fact only a handful of them, 6, 7 of them, that were particularly notorious. And those were the ones that I felt I wanted to be trained, yes, to kill them. That's what I wanted to do.
Well, interestingly, one of my friends who was in that unit, I think what he admitted to me when he hit the problems inside the country and we were trying to solve them, he just said it's not easy going about saying you want to go and kill somebody. And then when he was sent into that situation, admitted to me once that the difference between intellectually wanting to meet this aim of the ANC and actually going out and doing it were chasms apart.
I don't at all feel, and I never did at the time, that there would have been one thing wrong with killing those people. Not at all. And I don't think that I would ever have had anything in my system, any conscience problems at all. I think I had got to a level with them where they were no longer people.
And interestingly, of that group, none of them killed anybody, and I don't think they could have.
I believe I'd worked through those matters as a person, death and all of that. And it was not an issue for me.
I don't think I could do it. I mean, I just look back and I don't think it was possible for me to do it. But we coexisted, we were co-responsible, we coexisted in an environment where some people did.
We had serious situations where we discovered enemy agents amongst ourselves, especially in the camps. There's a time when all of us were poisoned. Our food was poisoned by one of us. Now, such people, if you have to get information from them, you can't just get it from talking nicely to them. You have to use the same tactics that the enemy was using.
But that's one of the problems of such a struggle. You enter a struggle like this, you go into a very defensive situation, you're under enormous attack, particularly by the end of the 80s. The infiltration of South African agents was massive.
We are not sorry that we were part of the struggle, we shouldn't be apologetic about it. The things that happened had to happen. If people were to be tortured, they had to be tortured. Because, being in a guerrilla army, you are not like in a normal army.
You're in a very insecure environment. People are away from their home territory. They're scattered all over the world. They're under attack all the time. And so while your objective is to create a new vision, and that's out there as evident, the process towards it almost drives you in the opposite direction, takes away an open and creative approach on life. I think these are the contradictions.
Well, there were people who were tortured by mistake because of wrong information. I feel sad for that, but as you know, in any struggle, innocent lives, people die innocently.
I don't know. As I told you, you sit on judgment today in a free South Africa, fruit juice in front of you, and you're judging people in a different circumstance. I can't do it.
We've just talked about in terms of comrades with very high moral principles relating to the society they want to create, seeking democracy, and then supporting torture. That's a huge contradiction.
It's very odd, Whom are you going to free if you go on a campaign of torturing your own people, sometimes going to an extent whereby you eliminate them. It doesn't make any sense. Really doesn't make any sense to any normal person.
Viel später lesen wir einen Brief, den Jenny damals an ihre engste Freundin geschrieben hat. Es geht um die dunkle Seite des Befreiungskampfes in diesem Brief. Um Fragen, auf die auch Jenny keine Antwort weiß. Was ist, wenn die Methoden des Feindes beginnen, das eigene Verhalten zu bestimmen? Wenn man, wie Zidi sagt, nur mit der Folter des einen Menschen das Leben der anderen retten kann, heiligt dann der Zweck die Mittel? Diese alte, furchtbare Frage, in der, wie man sie auch beantwortet, die Unschuld für immer zugrunde geht. Jenny schreibt von der Trauer und von dem Gefühl der inneren Leere, das sich ausbreitet in ihr. Und wie es ihr immer schwerer wird, mitten in diesen Widersprüchen das leben zu können, was doch der Impuls für sie war, sich dem Kampf überhaupt anzuschließen. Mitgefühl, Empathie. Die Sehnsucht to make things right, die Welt wieder heiler zu machen. Dann die Desmond-Geschichte. Der Punkt, an dem der Widerspruch zwischen Vision und Realität für Jenny den Höhepunkt erreicht. Desmond, einer von Jennys besten Untergrundkämpfern, den sie zum Verlassen des Landes auffordern muss, gegen seinen Willen, weil um ihn herum das gesamte Untergrundnetz zusammenbricht, weil seine Verhaftung das Leben anderer gefährden könnte. Desmond, der diesen Befehl verweigert und sich so regelwidrig verhält, dass er in Verdacht gerät, ein feindlicher Agent zu sein und für Jahre in einem ANC-Straflager verschwindet.
It's a Desmond issue. It's one of the saddest stories of somebody where the ANC couldn't recognize the difference between someone who'd probably had one of the most fundamental nervous or psychological breakdowns and instead looked at this person as an enemy agent because their behavior had changed so dramatically. And the ANC's responses to that were awful. There's no doubt about it. There's no excuse for the extremity of the response to his case.
Ein Jahr nach diesem Interview kommt die Nachricht, Desmond ist tot. Nach seiner Rückkehr aus dem Straflager mit dem Auto verunglückt. Für eine Aussprache zwischen ihm und Jenny war es zu spät. Und auch vor der Wahrheitskommission konnte er nun nicht mehr aussagen.
That's one which I would live with and never feel resolved about. And now that he's dead, it means that we've never even had an opportunity to talk about it, although I'm not sure even talking about would have helped because the crisis for him was so great. I think that whole period was an emotional disaster. I mean, that in terms of the tension and anxiety, the dislocation I experienced from ordinary day society was enormous.
I remember Jenny taking me at the bus station to take the bus to the airport. I was going back to Lusaka. And her divorce had just come through.
Mohamed Timol, Nachrichtendienst des ANC in Zimbabwe.
And she told me that her divorce came through, and she was very emotional about it. But I couldn't respond to her. I just couldn't respond. Not that I didn't want to respond to her, but I could not feel sympathetic towards her. But these were the barriers that individuals put up.
One of the rules in the organization was don't mourn. Do you know what mourn means? Don't mourn, mobilize. And I thought it was a wonderful slogan. Absolutely. Don't mourn, mobilize. But when I lost my son in '89, and comrades were saying, don't mourn, mobilize. And suddenly I thought, this is rubbish, absolute rubbish, because if you need to do anything, you need to mourn, you know? You need to grieve. And how else do you deal with the pain?
But the times demanded that we do not allow ourselves to be emotional.
I just got burnt out. I mean, I just had it, where you get nausea and be sick all the time. You'd been doing for, 8 years, the same work, very intense, and all the workload kept doing was increasing and increasing and increasing. We were working some 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. And the depression. The other feature was memory loss. You would undertake to do something and you wouldn't remember it 10 minutes later. I then went to the comrades and said, listen, I have to immediately stop the underground work because I'm a danger to people and I can't cope. And the response I got was, people just don't stop working because they're tired. I mean, I was so hurt that after 6 years of solidly working together with comrades, that even if they couldn't understand what had happened to me, that even if they didn't know what full burnout was.
It was purely a question of survival and maintaining your sanity at all times, because we had this grave responsibility of fighting against an evil system. So in a way, one lost that compassion and that emotion in the process.
Even that, they could have given me the benefit of the doubt and said, we accept what you're saying is that you can't manage at the moment and you're sick and you need to stop. They didn't do that. It was very harsh. I was so eager to be kind of part of everything again because of that exclusion. Because it was challenging an entire way of living for the previous 10 years. That's your life, those are your relationships, those are the people you know. It's a huge break to get out of it if you wanted to. The unbanning of the ANC on, February the 8th was a complete shock.
In fact, in the ANC, I think I was the first one to know. One of the editors of a newspaper here phoned me at 8 o'clock in the morning and said, Phil, I'll be seeing you soon. So I said, when are you coming? He says, no, you'll be coming home. I said, what? So he says, Phil, de Klerk's speech I've got before me now, and it says that the ANC is going to be unbanned.
So I went rushing off to the Holiday Inn in Harare, and I saw Zuma just getting into the lift and dashed in after him and said, you won't believe this. I said, the ANC has been unbanned.
So I phoned the ANC in Lusaka, and I said to them, look, we're going to be unbanned. De Klerk's speech at 11 o'clock today is going to unban us. They said, shut up, Phyllis, you're just dreaming. Truly.
That night, we all got together and were drinking. And for the first time, comrades started talking about their past, where they might have lived in South Africa, how they felt about certain things. It was a bit like we all knew somehow that past now could come forward.
And I thought, this is our new South Africa.
you know? It was a moment, it was like a blip, where we all forgot about concealing our lives and who we were, etc. But then the next day it was like that night before hadn't existed. I was then sent back in by headquarters to follow Zuma, who was going in to prepare for the Fruiteskeer talks. So it was the first talks that were going to take place between the ANC leadership, who were going to fly into the country, and the government.
To go to South Africa, this is after de Klerk's thing, wherein you will begin to discuss the issue of talks, to remove the obstacles.
So I drove all the way through down to Gaborone and crossed first of all into Botswana. I was very nervous. There was no clearance for me to come in, no amnesty, nothing. You know, the whole point was that it was very early days of negotiations. No one quite knew what the outcome would be. No one knew how much one could trust the government. It was keep guard, keep guard, keep guard. It was always that sense. So always that feeling of detachment from what I was actually doing, because I was always watching what would happen, watching whether cars didn't follow, that I was not being checked coming in. And the rain was just coming down in sheets, and I could barely see. So by the time I got into Johannesburg, it was about 10, 11 at night. And I had been driving for probably 20 hours. So it was really, I was absolutely wiped out. And then I waited for Zuma to phone, and I waited 24 hours. I didn't leave. He said, wait. So I would sit in the flat and just watch people walk past and watch the trees. So that's why I waited for contact.
Ich erinnere mich, dass ich Jenny traf, als sie Zuma begleitete bei den ersten Gesprächen zwischen Regierung und ANC. Wir haben geredet, fast eine Nacht hindurch. Was sie mir nicht erzählte, der ANC hatte entschieden, parallel zum Verhandlungsprozess die Kampfbereitschaft der Kader aufrechtzuerhalten, bis klar sein würde, ob der Regierung zu trauen sei. Was auch Jenny damals nicht wissen konnte, dass die gefährlichste Phase des Untergrunds noch vor ihr lag.
I can't quite recall why Zuma thought it was so important that I worked with Kevin, but he decided that the two of us needed to pair up and that we were going to develop the underground, the ANC underground inside the country, with us operating from Johannesburg.
What was you actually feeling when you met this white lady?
Maybe the white lady is not so much a white lady in our situation. You don't see a person through the type of eyes. And I think there were other people around that were not necessarily attached to the unit, so there was always a type of a fallback type of situation in case the white lady gave problems.
No one expected this young white woman with such an innocent face would be doing what I was doing. So with Kevin, for example, we had to move a weapon into Soweto. So Kevin and I decided that we would be a young couple who would be going to a wedding in Soweto. So I dressed up in a beautiful summer frock, and he was dressed up, and he's nice and good looking in his shirt, suit, and looking very snazzy. And we wrapped up the weapon in wedding paper and bows and little things, and lay it on the seat. So there was this nice long present on the seat. And we drove into Soweto, and as we were coming into Soweto, there was a major roadblock. And I must admit, I was really terrified when we were approaching this roadblock, because we've got really concrete evidence sitting on the back seat. Kevin and I drove up, and my heart was thumping until we hit the roadblock, and the policeman comes. I'm driving because Kevin couldn't drive. Comes to the driver's seat, looks at us, talks to Kevin and not me, and says to him, where are you going? And he says it's a wedding. And basically then smiles at him and winks and says, God, you're a lucky man, look after her, hey? And says you can go on. And we looked so much the happy young couple. And that was the advantage that I could use as being a white.
was a very strange time. We were very isolated. You were in the country, it was a period of reform, and yet we didn't move with the normal society, we didn't connect with it.
With the unbanning of the ANC, you had a completely untested and unexplored type of an area of work where intelligence work was concerned.
The first orders were to start developing underground intelligence units.
Very briefly, our task was never very clear in terms of when and what to do.
It was much more that we were on our own. It was very difficult to get meetings with the leadership. The leadership were very busy dealing with negotiations. We couldn't get meetings, we couldn't get instructions, we couldn't get a sense of what they wanted. And I found that we started operating almost like our own little world, a little bit like a cocoon in this township, trying to decide what was right for the situation, without any reference to the broader political environment.
We'd been sent into the townships to try and find out what was happening. The violence had broken out. The ANC believed that it was in Carter with security forces. We didn't really know what was happening. We were just knowing that suddenly whole communities were under massive attack by hostile dwellers, and that police seemed to be in collusion with them.
Ich erinnere mich, dass Jenny mich einmal in eines dieser Hostels begleitet hat. Diese kasernenähnlichen Männerwohnheime, in denen die Wanderarbeiter, meistens Zulus, wie in einem Ghetto lebten, isoliert von der Umgebung und getrennt von ihren Familien. Der Konfliktstoff zwischen den Insassen dieser Wohnheime und der Township-Bevölkerung war geradezu vorprogrammiert. Auf der einen Seite eine fast nur Zulu sprechende ländliche, relativ ungebildete Arbeiterschaft, traditionsgebunden und auf Gehorsam getrimmt, und auf der anderen Seite eine englischsprachige städtische Bevölkerung, kritisch und selbstbewusst. Dazu die alten ethnischen Spannungen zwischen Zulus und Xhosas, verbunden auch noch mit dem politischen Machtkampf zweier Parteien, zwischen Inkatha, der Partei vorwiegend der Zulus, und dem ANC. Eine gefährliche Mischung, die die Regierung bewusst zur Explosion brachte, um den ANC bei den bevorstehenden Wahlen zu schwächen. Wie sich nämlich später herausstellte, hatte das Regime selbst mit Hilfe schwarz geschminkter Sicherheitsbeamten Kämpfe zwischen den feindlichen Gruppen geplant und provoziert.
Kevin and I then decided that we would go to Kwesini Hostel as journalists and see if we couldn't start identifying who might be the leading figure in that hostel, and who would be the Inkatha figure who would be driving the violence. We went at about 6 in the evening, maybe 5 or 6. It was getting dark. The sun is going down. There's this courtyard, it's very derelict hostel. There's lots of men there. There's a bar area, very drunk people, kids running around, and then at odd points these women with these white faces staring at us. And I think they were rather shocked that we'd walked in. And anyway, we asked to see the head of Inkatha in that hostel. And all the men, a whole crowd gathered around us. And Kevin was the interpreter. You don't speak English in that situation. But he had to, his safety was only secured if they thought he was really a proper Zulu. And the crowd and the mood would just shift and change from reason and then anger and shouting and screaming at us.
But as you're talking to them, you can see a development of some kind of a formation around them, and a slow building of like a circle around you, and as you're talking to them, it's slowly moving closer and closer.
It was extremely volatile. We didn't actually know whether we were going to actually walk out of that hostel alive.
And it was then that I said, now we going.
So in this area with very traditional people, I gave them my business card and I said, phone me. And I thought, I've got to get out of here. This is absolute hell. And then very calmly Kevin said, now just walk, don't look behind you, and just keep going.
You wouldn't have been in a position to have defended yourself in any way. They would have done anything.
after that, I got a fright. I said to Kevin, we should never have done that. But it was like we would do anything. It was like there were no limits on the danger. It had gone to a point of being mad. Kevin and I were like two lone people out there, trying to find solutions.
Oh, it was terrible. Actually, most of the residents in the location, they ran away because of this Inkatha.
Edna Radu, eine Township-Bewohnerin.
When these men come to attack us, before they come, you will hear the women cheering them up, that sort of a thing. We know that the Inkatha now is coming out.
It's late at night, very quiet here. Lights are off, it's dark, it's scary in the township. It's quiet. And from here, right inside here, when we are here, you hear this singing. That singing goes through you, and permitting that sound is the terror that comes with it. A very, very cold terror. You sweat. And when they sing, they cross the street, they come here, they're singing. It paralyzes you completely. You can actually see the person shaking, changing in face. The gunshot outside, person changes completely.
You had no hope of living, not knowing what is the moral carrying you.
Once the lights go down, you're at it again.
People were living through hell. And I think the mistake we made was thinking that we ourselves could fix that, take away that hell. And that when we couldn't, we just tried harder and we just moved to more extremes.
I've been in situations where I was completely surrounded alone, and unfortunately having a gun on me, you break out of that after being hit by sticks. You break away from them, you run 10 paces, you outrun them, you turn. As you're running, you pull out a gun, and then you turn and then you look at them. You don't shoot. I've saved a number of people from the other side. In that war situation, I would stand in between our own people from the township and whoever would be trapped from the other side. With a gun, if you take it out, point it at a person, you shoot, that's the end of a person. But where you take yourself as an example, you've got such a history, you've got parents, you've got so many dreams, there's so much that you're working on. You also transplant that into the next human being that you'll be looking at. And if you pull it and shoot at a person, that's the end of it, just like that. You learn to appreciate that there definitely would be more to it than this. There is more than you can do to save a situation than doing that. But to be part of a process where people die, it kills you even further. It dampens part of your sharpness towards appreciation what life is. But that serves to indicate that there is something that is dead in you already, somehow. You can't necessarily say this is what is dead in me, but you die a little bit. Oh, I love this rain. I just love it. Really.
There was a lot of emotional desperation and
we all were finding it very, very difficult to cope there.
Because after months, if you're still getting no guidance and there's still no strategy and people are still being killed, the doubt about the movement and how it was managing that situation did set in.
This situation caught a lot of people unawares. There was no policy, no guidelines, no infrastructure, no approach, and therefore no answers from the leadership.
So in many ways we were self-appointed. You've become a bit like gods unto yourself. You know, you this. And I just doubted what we were doing was right.
It's like almost you're closing your eyes and walking into a situation.
And you kind of feel you're heading for some precipice. Anyway, we picked up information that there was going to be a big attack. So we went off to one of the ANC leadership. It was a Sunday night, 8 o'clock, so I went to his hotel in Johannesburg. Most of the leadership didn't live in the townships. They didn't connect with it. They didn't feel what it was like, day in and day out, to live under those conditions. And they would be detached in rooms talking about something. So it was like different worlds. And I think it was an older leadership that had come back to a very different South Africa. It bore no resemblance to the country that they had left 20, 30 years before when they went into exile. And I told him that there was going to be, our information was there was going to be an attack. And he said no, he didn't really know what to do about this, but maybe he would phone Mandela. So there was a complete absence of ideas on what to do about this. They didn't seem to know how to deal with it. A few hours later, about 1 o'clock that night, massive attack with firearms, and they gunned down 22 of the men from Zumkazizwe, all dead, just left in the field. Afterwards, I went in. The streets were absolutely deserted, except for Caspers, the armoured vehicles of the police that were dotted around, and then the palls of smoke rising up into the sky as cars were burning along the street, and then the rudimentary roadblocks which had been set up by the hostel dwellers, and they would man the roadblocks as you drove down, and they had their rudimentary weapons and that sort of thing. And it looked like Mad Max. It looked like, you know, that we'd gone into a sort of craziness where people would just become killing machines, and that there was no sense of humanity left at all. There's something also very eerie about a township when you know it's full of people, but there's just nothing. There's this absolute silence. That day had a profound effect on me. I couldn't see any point in what we were doing. I couldn't see that we were helping the situation at all. I felt that towards the end we were establishing a situation of banditry. And I realized that a lot of the people responsible for what I was looking at were our people. And we had trained up some of them. And they were no better than, in a sense, the IFP bandits anymore, because they were completely uncontrollable. The notion that you can just go and arm people and have self-defense units and that they will kind of protect the people, it became clear that that was nonsense. You can't just willy-nilly arm people and expect that you can manage that situation. And it resulted in me just reviewing completely my involvement in that violence and just pulling back, just thinking, we cannot engage in this. We had stopped having normal restraints on us. I don't know, it's like, I felt I'd become almost suicidal. I felt like a lemming. You know those animals, we just had to keep going and keep going and keep going, but we were killing ourselves. At some moment, I think I just paused and saw this, and just saw this image of being dangerous to myself. And yeah, I just got out. I just thought this was enough. It took a long time to feel that I was getting out of the underground. part of getting out of it was part of regaining something of myself.
There was nothing left. The commander certainly wasn't there. That sense of having the purpose, the person fighting in a struggle or anything like that. And I think a lot of confusion, a lot of self-criticism, a huge emptiness, loneliness, but a sense that I needed to stay with that. And I think the overriding feeling was a sense of discovering myself again, that I'd lost any contact with myself.
All the time I'd felt that I had died, that there was just always this dead feeling, until at some point it felt like there was a huge break. I remembered once just walking in the streets and the trees looked different. The sky had a different color to it. Everything looked clearer. That's when I was convinced what I was doing was the correct thing. It was a sense that I was tapping, for the first time, my feelings again.
For Jenny, it was quite simple. Even if it was a very difficult decision for her to say, look, I can't cope.
I could get employment, which many ANC people didn't feel.
Myself, I'm supposed to be paid by the ANC, and I can't just say, look, people, I give up. Well, what would I have done after that?
But also, I didn't live in the townships. So I could actually get out of physical view from people, which in fact someone like Kevin could not get out of physical view.
And besides, I think I'd been in this situation much, much longer. My semi, not very healthy mental state was something which was quite normal to myself and acceptable. It was one of those very, very difficult moments in my life, but I had no choice. Like, I was part and parcel of it, and I had no form of escape.
»26. April 1994. Die erste demokratische Wahl in Südafrika. Nach 4 Jahren Verhandlung zwischen Apartheid-Regime und Befreiungsbewegung stimmen die schwarzen Südafrikaner zum ersten Mal darüber ab, wer sie regiert. 1652 waren die Weißen ins Land gekommen. 3,5 Jahrhunderte hatte es gedauert, bis die damaligen Eindringlinge bereit waren, das Land zu teilen mit der ursprünglichen Bevölkerung. Kevin geht in Durban zur Wahl, immer noch mit falschem Pass in der Tasche. Und er gibt seine Stimme ab mit einem Namen, der nicht sein wirklicher Name ist.
One thing which would have affected my emotions very serious was that I never expected to be here today.
Happy with it? Please pass it in. So you can always get another before you pass it in here.
Well, given a chance, I've actually, this is very personal. I've actually organized some people that maybe we should buy some champagnes on the ready to celebrate. Whether you're normal or not, I think you have a right to celebrate.
I feel optimistic from the point of view that at least it represents a firm break with the past, and you've got an opportunity to change the future. For myself, it has been better, and I hope, one can only hope that for the country it is as well, that if the society will look at itself critically, and I think that's very important, there is a potential to grow. It's when people want to block out self-analysis or criticism that I think we start losing something of what we struggled for, and that's what we've got to see. How much openness does come out after this election? How much do people feel that they can honestly talk about what they went through?
I, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa,
Was hat es gekostet, bis zu diesem Augenblick zu kommen? Ein so langer Kampf. Und auch für die, die heute dabei sind, so viel verlorenes Leben.
Having gone through the type of life that one has you'd say, if possible, if you had the means and whatever will left in you, you try to assist as much as possible to avoid anybody going through this type of a life. And I look at young people, the way they react to situations, the way they do things, and I think I wouldn't be bitter. But if given a choice, I think I would have loved to have gone through that.
Kevin war, als er die Schule abbrach, um in den Kampf zu gehen, so alt wie diese Schüler jetzt. Er ist nun, nach fast 20 Jahren Arbeit im Untergrund, ohne abgeschlossene Schulbildung und ohne erlernten Beruf. Mit einem Wissen und Können, das er erworben hat für eine Mission, die Vergangenheit ist, die ihn kaum qualifiziert für den Beruf, den er liebt. Arbeit mit Jugendlichen als richtigen Beruf, nicht nur mal ehrenamtlich, das hätte er sich gewünscht, erzählt er. Aber wie kann er jetzt noch einmal ganz von vorne anfangen?
You still find a lot of the past coming in from time to time. You can't, I believe, without help, get rid of it completely. I've spent most of my time on my own, and that taught me quite a lot. And not only a will to survive, but an ability to survive on your own, completely alone. But then that would also make it very easy for a person like myself to disappear into self and shut himself out from the rest of the world. That happens very easily, where you can decide that you're not going to accept any calls, you're not going to call anybody, and actually think and hope that you survive, and actually maybe at times do. There are things that you'd consider to be the most normal in life that you would not have had an opportunity to have enjoyed. Perhaps family, being also in a position to go to people openly, being in a position to give somebody your phone number, tell them where you work, visit people. But basically is to perhaps wake up from this bed and come back to the very same bed and not be worried about looking behind your back in terms of who is following you. So those are basic things that perhaps other people would not have appreciated, but it's a very big relief for you. It's something you learn to enjoy. So my movement from the abnormal to normal has been extremely, extremely slow, with no visible steps between the gaps, if there were any form of gaps, to perhaps the last stage when I resigned my last job.
And now you are above ground.
I'm not too sure of that. I'm not too sure of that. But I'm not active. I'm not doing anything serious, so I wouldn't say that. I'm not sure what it means being normal.
Eine Wirtschaftskonferenz in Cannes, die Jenny organisiert hat. Als Expertin für ökonomische Fragen vermittelt sie zwischen der südafrikanischen Regierung und Vertretern der Wirtschaft. Ihre ehemaligen Gefährten des Untergrunds sind Politiker geworden, Minister im südafrikanischen Parlament. Und Thabo Mbeki, damals mit ihr ein Comrade im Kampf, ist heute Präsident des Landes und ist Gast und Redner auf dieser Konferenz.
I think it's a feeling of that we've become normal. What is so extraordinary for me is they're like two worlds. And if you're dealing with ministers and they're politicians, I suppose before there seemed to be more emotion, more passion, more innocence. It's different. People have moved on. The difficulty is whether you've moved away from certain principles or whether you have found a way of expressing those principles, but in another form. Now, you say, well, this is life. But are you saying, this is life and I can do nothing? Or are you saying, this is life and I can do something? And that's the dilemma. And I think that is a dilemma for the ANC. But I'm not sure it's a dilemma it can get out of, because it also has to engage this world. It has to engage business. It has to get investment. It has to perform in certain ways. And they're not the ways anybody ever thought they would have to perform in.
What has the change meant to you personally?
It sounds dreadful, doesn't it? But it's I suppose, in a sense, taking charge of my life. And part of taking charge of my life was adopting Mark. Because he was very much a choice about wanting a child and a family of my own that I want him to explore as much as I explored. And I suppose that's the one issue where I feel that I haven't changed. I think I'm reconciled with the past. I think the past was very difficult. So I'm not saying it was easy, and I'm not saying I would go back into it from where I am today, would make a choice to go back into it. I'm not sure I would do that. It's more knowing myself and where I was, that was the right thing to do, but that I've moved on as well, and I'm happy I've moved on.
I don't think I have any form of regret where my participation is concerned. Not at all. Not at all. I think I've lost a lot through my work, through decisions that I'd taken consciously. Not only the marriage part, I think there's a lot that happened. There's a lot that is still going to affect me for a long time. But I still think that it was the correct decision. I don't have any form of regret, except if you can ask me now, say, can you go back again? I would say, wait a minute, I need to think.
Seldom do we actually sit down and open ourselves up and look back. We're not always ready to do it.
I think it has been a long, long way, very long. We found the home. It is here, and it is for us to make it warm.
Not fulfillment yet. The feeling that I've got unfinished business. That's the feeling.
It's one of the almost fundamental flaws of a struggle, is that it doesn't prepare for the day after.
The terrain is different. It is very easy to actually get derailed.
The morality that drove the revolution is disappearing. That's what frightens me.
The danger is that one does lose the drive to take things a step further.
I ask myself about the people who were throwing stones out in Soweto. They're still out there. They have to come back to beg for jobs, to beg for food, to beg for everything.
And hopefully we could have here in South Africa a society where we care about people, you know?
There are a number of times when one faces problems and then you sit down and say, well, listen, why don't I just get the hell out of this whole thing? And then you sit back and say, but you know, is that the right way of remembering those who have actually gone? Would it be fair, in fact, even to their own children, to say that this is why their parents died and today nobody bothers? And that's why I say the commitment has got to be stronger.